Okay, good morning, everyone. So we're going to finish off this little retreat, and we still have a few suttas to go, so I'm just going to carry on with the suttas. And we're going to finish off the ideas of surrounding the eternalist view, and then we're going to have a quick look at the Uchedavada, the annihilationism as well. And then we're going to summarize everything, I think, in a few words. In how many words? In one word. So we're going to summarize the whole retreat in one word. That's kind of very handy. So let's see how that goes. So the next sutta we're going to have a look at is known as the Mahatanha Sankhya Sutta, and the longer sutta on the ending of craving. And this is one of the classic suttas where they talk about the eternalist view and how that is wrong and how you should look upon the mind and consciousness in the right kind of way. So this is what this sutta is about. So here we have again, this is Bhante Suddhata's translation that we have here. So I have heard, at one time the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery. Now at that time, a mendicant means bhikkhu or bhikkhuni, called Sati, the fisherman's son, had the following harmful misconception. As I understand the Buddha's teachings, it is this very same consciousness that roams and transmigrates, not another. So this is almost like the definition of the eternalist view. The same consciousness, there's no change. It's a inherent essence of a human being, if you like. That's kind of the idea here. Interesting, harmful misconception. Yeah, we don't normally think about these things as harmful, but from a Dhamma point of view, it is, because it blocks your exit from samsara. Wrong views, that's the kind of the problem with wrong views. They stop you from awakening. That's kind of why it is so pernicious and why it is so negative. You can go a long way on the path and have a wrong view, but there comes a point when you can't go any further and you are blocked by that view. And that's why we are dealing with this in such great detail. Several mendicants heard about this. They went to Sati and said to him, "Is it really true, Venerable Sati, that you have such a harmful misconception? As I understand the Buddha's teachings, it is this very same consciousness that roams and transmigrates, not another." Absolutely, Reverends. As I understand the Buddha's teachings, it is this very same consciousness that roams and transmigrates, and not another. Then, wishing to dissuade Sati from his view, the mendicants pursued, pressed, and grilled him. "Don't say that, Sati. Don't misrepresent the Buddha, for misrepresentation of the Buddha is not good." And the Buddha would not say that. In many ways, the Buddha has said that consciousness is dependently originated, since without a cause, consciousness does not come to be. So that is the fundamental difference between pre-Buddhist or non-Buddhist ideas and the Buddhist idea. Consciousness itself depends on causes and conditions for its very existence. But even though the mendicants pressed him in this way, Sati obstinately stuck to his misconception and insisted on it, stating it again. When they weren't able to dissuade Sati from his view, the mendicant went to the Buddha, bowed, sat down to one side, and told him what had happened. So the Buddha addressed a certain monk. "Please, monk, in my name, tell the mendicant Sati that the teacher summons him." "Yes, sir," that monk replied. He went to Sati and said to him, "Reverend Sati, the teacher summons you." Imagine if you heard that. Yeah, the door. Scary. Yeah. "Yes, Reverend," Sati replied. He went to the Buddha, bowed, and sat down to one side. The Buddha said to him, "Is it really true, Sati, that you have such a harmful misconception? As I understand the Buddha's teachings, it is this very same consciousness that roams and transmigrates, not another." "Absolutely, sir." As I understand the Buddha's teachings, it is this very same consciousness that roams and transmigrates, not another. Sati, what is that consciousness? Sir, it is he who speaks and feels and experiences the results of good and bad deeds in all the different realms. And you will notice that this has some connection to what we saw before. We're looking at the Sabbasava Sutta, the second sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, all the defilements. And it has that same phrase about experiencing the good and the bad deeds in the various realms or various places. So in other words, the consciousness that you have now is the same one that experienced the results, maybe in some future life or whatever. In other words, it's this eternalist view, the view of things just carrying on. We can see here also that eternalism has a kind of different connotations or different ways of being expressed by different teachers. So one way of thinking about eternalism is that when you die, you carry on for eternity. The Atman and the Brahman is one, and you just become part of that Brahman, and that's it, really. Another way of thinking about eternal consciousness is that it's the same consciousness that goes from one birth to the next one. And maybe eventually it can be liberated from that sequence of births, and then you become one with Brahman or with God or whatever it is. So slightly different ideas here about this eternal consciousness. But regardless, it is the permanence of consciousness, some inherent essence, which is the problem, regardless of how you formulate those views. That is the root cause and the root problem we're trying to deal with. And the Buddha says, silly man, the Pali word is moga purisa. So moga, remember yesterday we had this one of the people called Moga Raja, the king of silliness. It's kind of an interesting name, isn't it? Moga Raja. Anyway, silly man, who on earth have you ever known me to teach in that way? Haven't I said in many ways that consciousness is dependently originated, since consciousness does not arise without a cause? But still, you misrepresent me by your wrong grasp, harm yourself, and make much bad karma. This will be for your lasting harm and suffering. So, because you are misrepresenting the Buddha, it's kind of that's a bad idea. Yeah, so you have to really investigate the teachings of the Buddha carefully to ensure that you don't say anything which goes against the teachings, because that is kind of carries with it a certain responsibility that you represent the Buddha in the right way. If you don't, well then, you're undermining the whole Dhamma, you're undermining the whole sasana, basically, and obviously that is going to be problematic. However, if you have integrity and you realize that you had the wrong view and then you change your view, well then you are okay, then you're heading in the right direction again. So it's only if you keep holding on to these things all the time, never letting it go, that it really is a problem. But if you have the integrity and the open-mindedness to always change course, well then basically that's what you should be doing. So then the Buddha said to the mendicants, what do you think, mendicants? Has this mendicant sati kindled even a spark of wisdom in this teaching and training? How could that be, sir? No, sir. When this was said, Sati sat silent, embarrassed, shoulders drooping, downcast, depressed, with nothing to say. This is a standard formula in the sutras. When you kind of have been told off, then this is what happens. Knowing this, the Buddha said, silly man, you will be known by your own harmful misconception. I will question the mendicants about this. Then the Buddha said to the mendicants, mendicants, do you understand my teaching as Sati does? When he misrepresents me with his wrong grasp, harms himself and makes much bad karma? No, sir. For in many ways the Buddha has told us that consciousness is dependently originated, since without the cause, consciousness does not come to be. Good, mendicants. It is good that you understand my teaching like this. For in many ways I have told you that consciousness is dependently originated, since without the cause, consciousness does not come to be. But still, this sati misrepresents me with his wrong grasp, harms himself and makes much good karma. This will be for his harm and suffering, for his lasting harm and suffering. Consciousness is reckoned according to the specific condition upon which it arises. Consciousness that arises dependent on the eye and sights is reckoned as eye consciousness. Consciousness that arises depending on the ear and sounds is reckoned as ear consciousness. Consciousness that arises dependent on the nose and smells is reckoned as nose consciousness. Consciousness that arises depending on the tongue and tastes is reckoned as tongue consciousness. Consciousness that arises depending on the body and touches is reckoned as body consciousness. Consciousness that arises dependent on the mind and thoughts or ideas is reckoned as mind consciousness. So, first of all, we have seen that consciousness is dependently arisen. It cannot exist without a cause. This is one of the ways in which you can show that eternalism is wrong. Consciousness is a contingent phenomenon. It's not something that is always there. That is one way. The other way is to show that there are these different classes of consciousness. Vijnana kaya, they're called in the suttas, groups of consciousness. It's the word kaya again, meaning a group or a conglomeration or something like that of phenomena. And so there are 6 groups of consciousness depending on the 6 senses. And that means that when consciousness moves from one sense to another one, it's a different thing. It is not the same thing. And because it's not the same thing, it means that it's something that arises and comes. It's not just the same consciousness, mind consciousness that changes all the time. It moves from one sense to the next one. And this makes it into something fundamentally different as it moves about. So this is another way of thinking about the non-permanence of consciousness. So the Buddha always provides different ways of thinking about this. And these different ways kind of allows us a broader grasp of what is going on and kind of different avenues for approaching the idea of non-self, both inside and outside of meditation practice. So 6 classes of consciousness. And you will notice that this is a part of dependent origination, right? Dependent origination, consciousness arises depending on mind and thought. So you have the 6 sense spaces, and then you have phassa. So 6 sense spaces, the 6 senses, and then you have phassa. Phassa is when you have consciousness, the object, and the sense space coming together, and then you get Vedana from that. So kind of the root of dependent origination is kind of seen here, how the process works. And then the Buddha has a simile. It is like fire, which is reckoned according to the specific conditions dependent upon which it burns. A fire that burns dependent on logs is reckoned as a log fire. A fire that burns dependent on twigs is reckoned as a twig fire. A fire that burns depending on grass is reckoned as a grass fire. A fire that burns depending on cow dung is reckoned as a cow dung fire. A fire that burns depending on husks is reckoned as a husk fire. A fire that burns depending on rubbish is reckoned as a rubbish fire. And those fires will be slightly different, right? Because the heat given off will depend on the kind of substance that is being burned. And so the fires will not be exactly the same when they burn, depending on specific different conditions. In the same way, consciousness is reckoned according to the specific conditions upon which it arises. So that is the Buddha's argument, one of the very important arguments against eternalism or eternal consciousness, or any kind of eternal thing really. But remember here that the consciousness is the most profound way that something can be eternal. And this is the way that normally eternalism is explained as some kind of constant eternal mind or consciousness. And so if you can argue against the eternal consciousness, well, then you really argue against all kinds of eternalism in one go. So now we're going to have a look at another sutta which also discusses eternalism very briefly, and this is one that is often quoted, and so it is especially in circles that debate these issues. And this is a sutta from the Abhyakarta Samyutta, Samyutta Nikaya 44, and this is a sutta with, it's called with Ananda, but it actually is mostly with a wanderer called Vacchagotta. Vacchagotta occurs in so many suttas, and he would always go to the Buddha and ask him questions. I don't know how much time the Buddha spent with this one person. It's just amazing. The Buddha was very patient. Every time he would answer his questions or whatever. But Vacchagotta turned out to be a good disciple. Probably the Buddha could see the potential in Vacchagotta, and so he gave him a lot of time, and eventually, as far as I can recall, he became an arahant, so he was probably worth the investment, as they say. And this sutta goes as follows. Then the wanderer Vacchagotta went up to the Buddha and exchanged greetings with him. When the greetings and polite conversation were over, he sat down to one side and said to the Buddha, "Master Gautama, does the self survive?" Atti atta is the Pali. Atti atta, usually you would translate, does the self exist? Yeah, that's the normal kind of translation. But Bhante Sujato translates as, does the self survive? And the reason for that is because of the understanding, the background understanding of people who ask this question. Remember before we talked about attita and nattita. Yeah, this is equivalent to eternalism and annihilationism. Literally, existentness and non-existentness is what attita and nattita mean. And so when he comes to the Buddha and says, is there a self? He is referring to that eternal kind of self that is proclaimed by the attita doctrine, the teaching of existentness, or whatever you want to call it. And so if you say, is there a self? Well, then you're coming from a Buddhist perspective. Yeah, is there a self? If the Buddha replies to him from a Buddhist perspective, well, that will be very misleading, because obviously Vacchagotta is not a Buddhist. He's a wanderer. He's probably most familiar with the Brahmanical doctrines, or maybe some wandering doctrines. And so he will understand this word according to the culture, not according to the Buddhist point of view. Yeah, so when the Buddha, if he says, does the self exist? And the Buddha says no, he will have no idea what the Buddha is talking about, because he comes from a completely different background. His background is the Brahmanical background, probably, and so he will think if the self doesn't exist, then it means Uchedavada, it means the annihilationist doctrine, because those are the only two options coming from that cultural background. So some people say, oh, the Buddha could just have said no here. Yeah, if he said no, then he would have kind of explained the Buddhist position. But if the Buddha says no, there's no way that the wanderer Vacchagotta would have understood that. The wanderer Vacchagotta would have misunderstood and interpreted it as Uchedavada rather than the Buddhist idea of non-self. And so for that reason, it is much better to translate as Bhante Sujato does, with does the self survive? Yeah, because that has to do with eternalism and annihilationism. If it survives, it's eternalism. If it doesn't survive, it's annihilationism. And so this is, I think, a good translation which circumvents that problem that otherwise is easy to miss what's going on here. I'm not sure if anyone is able to follow me on this, because, but hopefully some of you will get the point at least. It's hard to follow these things if you're not used to these ideas. So it's not surprising if you find it hard to follow what I'm saying. But it's not really that complicated once you get your head around it. Does the self survive? Yeah. At least we can know what that means. When he said this, the Buddha kept silent. One of the ways that the Buddha answers questions is by keeping silent. There's kind of 4 ways that he replies. Either I can't remember the 4 now, he answers in brief, he answers in detail, he asks a counter question, or he remains silent. So he remains silent. And then Vacchagotta says, well then, does the self not survive? Natti atta. Often translated, isn't there a self? But again, remember, this question is asked from the Brahmanical point of view. In other words, isn't there a self means, is the self annihilated when we die? That's really what that means. And so, again, the Buddha can't really answer this directly. Natti atta, if he just says no, then Vacchagotta will misunderstand. So for the second time, the Buddha kept silent. Then the wanderer Vacchagotta got up from his seat and left. And then, not long after Vacchagotta had left, Venerable Ananda said to the Buddha, "Sir, why didn't you answer Vacchagotta's questions?" Ananda, when Vacchagotta asked me whether the self survives, if I had answered that the self survives, I would have been siding with the ascetics and Brahmins who are eternalists. There is a self, the self survives, is eternalism. When Vacchagotta asked me whether the self does not survive, if I had answered that the self does not survive, or if you like, the self does not exist, I would have been siding with the ascetics and Brahmins who are annihilationists. When Vacchagotta asked me whether the self survives, if I had answered the self survives, would that have helped give rise to knowledge that all things are not self? No, sir. When Vacchagotta asked me whether the self does not survive, if I had answered the self does not survive, Vacchagotta, who is already confused, would have got even more confused, thinking it seems that the self that I once had no longer survives. So he had this idea of a self, and now he kind of gets confused because now suddenly that self doesn't survive and he doesn't really understand what is going on. So the problem here is that Vacchagotta doesn't have no idea about the Buddhist teachings, and once you understand the sutta in this light, it becomes quite clear what is going on. It is not in any way a sutta that promotes some sort of eternalism or anything like that, just because the Buddha doesn't answer. In fact, quite the opposite. And I think it's quite clear once you understand what is going on. Anyway, it's just for a bit of fun and games that I kind of read out these suttas. Actually, not really fun and games. It's for those who are interested in the deeper aspects of these things, because these are real questions that arise all the time in discussion about eternalism, annihilationism, and the Dhamma. And so for that reason, it is important to deal with these issues, especially for those of you, I guess many of the monastics here who are into these kind of discussions. Actually, it is quite important. So then there's a short sutta on dependent arising again, and I put it in there just to remind us that this is the Buddha's middle path or middle way between eternalism and annihilationism. So everything is dependently arisen. It carries on. If the causes are there, it stops if the causes are taken away. And that main cause is ignorance. So I'm not going to read it out again because I have read it out enough already. And I want to come to what is the second last sutta for this retreat. And this is called the Yamaka Sutta. It is found in the Kanda Samyutta, number 85. And now we come to the Ucheda Vada, finally. And this sutta shows us how the Dhamma is different from Ucheda Vada. Ucheda Vada is annihilation, Dhamma is cessation. How do these things compare? And this is what the sutta really is about. Then in the late afternoon, Venerable Sariputta came out of retreat, went to Venerable Yamaka and exchanged greetings with him. Seated to one side, he said to Yamaka, "Is it really true, Reverend Yamaka, that you have such a harmful misconception? As I understand the Buddha's teachings, a mendicant who has ended the defilements is annihilated and destroyed when the body breaks up and doesn't exist after death." So this is the kind of the annihilationist view. It's a particular kind. This is of annihilationist view. This is referring to the arahant, but still, this idea of annihilation means that there is a misconception there. So it's similar to what we have in the present day. When people say after you die, you just disappear. Similar to that, but here it's with reference to the arahant. But the idea is the same. So this is his view. And again, this is a harmful misconception. And he replies, "Yes, Reverend, that is how I understand the Buddha's teachings." A lot of people understand the Buddha's teachings in this way. It's not just Yamaka. In the present day, you discuss with people, they talk about the cessation idea, and they say they can't understand it. To them, it seems like annihilation. Something is being destroyed. And if you try to explain to them, sometimes they won't listen because they don't like the idea, and so they reject your arguments out of hand. But however, there is a very important difference between these two things, and that kind of gets to the crux of the Dhamma. And that difference is the doctrine of non-self. If you understand that in the right way, then you also understand the difference between annihilation and cessation. What do you think, Yamaka? Is form permanent or impermanent? Is it reliable or unreliable? Unreliable, Reverend. Is feeling, perception, choices, consciousness permanent or impermanent? Reliable or unreliable? Unreliable, Reverend. So you should truly see these things. And it's a continuation from the previous sutta, so it just kind of puts the dots in there. You should truly see these things as not self, etc., etc. And then they understand there is nothing further for this place, or this existence. This is the standard way that they discuss impermanence and non-self in the suttas, like we saw before in the Anattalakkana Sutta, similar kind of sequence. What do you think, Reverend Yamaka? Do you consider that the label realized one, this is Tathagata, applies to form? In other words, is the Tathagata, is he form? Or are they form? No, Reverend. Yes, the Buddha is not form. Do you consider the label Tathagata applies to feeling? In other words, is the Tathagata feeling? No, Reverend. Do you consider the label Tathagata applies to perception? In other words, is the Tathagata just perception? No, Reverend. Does the label Tathagata apply to choices, to the will, to the intentions? Is that what the Tathagata is, the will? No, Reverend. Do you consider the label Tathagata applies to consciousness? In other words, is the Tathagata consciousness? No, Reverend. You can see here how Venerable Sariputta is leading Yamaka along. Start getting him to see kind of the error of his views, stage by stage. So first of all, the Tathagata cannot be identified with any of the 5 khandhas. What do you think, Reverend Yamaka? Do you consider that the label realized one, in other words, Tathagata, applies in relation to form? So not actually form itself, but somehow related to form. No, Reverend. Do you consider that the label realized one applies apart from form? No, Reverend. In other words, is there some Tathagata outside of form or outside of the 5 khandhas somewhere? No. So you can see the problem here. The Tathagata, if the Tathagata exists, How does the Tathagata exist? Is the Tathagata any of the five khandhas? No. Is it all the five khandhas together? No. Is it apart from the five khandhas? No. Yeah, so what then is the Tathagata? This kind of gets exciting, doesn't it? So what is this Tathagata? Do you consider the label Tathagata applies in relation to feeling? Does it apply apart from feeling? Does it apply in relation to perception? Does it apply apart from perception? Does it apply in relation to the will, the choices? Does it apply apart from choices? Does it apply in relation to consciousness? Does it apply apart from consciousness? And in each and every case, the answer is no, Reverend. What do you think, Yamaka? Do you consider the label Tathagata applies to one who has form? And so form is what you own. One who has feeling, one who has perception, one who has the will or choices, one who has consciousness? No, Reverend. So basically, Tathagata is not really found anywhere. That's kind of the conclusion. In that case, Reverend Yamaka, since a realized one is not found by you as a genuine fact in this very life, is it cogent for you to declare? Is it logical for you to declare? As I understand the Buddha's teachings, a mendicant who has ended the defilements is annihilated and destroyed when their body breaks up and does not exist after death. So, of course, the answer is no. It is not cogent, it is not logical to think like that, because nothing is really destroyed. The Venerable Sariputta has just showed Venerable Yamaka that Tathagata is just a label applied to the five khandhas in a certain way. But these five khandhas are just these impermanent things. There isn't any real Tathagata there. Tathagata is a conventional term used to explain a person, but there is no real reality to that Tathagata apart from the changing phenomena of the world, the five khandhas. And so what is then getting destroyed? And of course the answer is that nothing is really getting destroyed apart from dukkha. And if you say that dukkha gets destroyed, does it make sense to call that annihilation? Maybe it does in one way. You can call it the annihilation of dukkha, but that is not what normally people think of when they talk about annihilation. What people think of is the annihilation of an existing thing inside. The ego, the sense of self, gets annihilated. Annihilation of dukkha is more like cessation of dukkha. It's a very different thing. It's a different way of looking at things. We get tricked by the sense of self. The sense of self tricks us into thinking that something is being destroyed, when in fact all that is happening is that suffering is ceasing. Two very different ideas. The cessation of suffering contra the destruction or annihilation of something that really exists in the first place. This is the difference between annihilation and cessation. Cessation is really a positive thing. Who doesn't want suffering to cease? Who doesn't want happiness to arise to the highest degree? It's a positive thing. The annihilation of the self, that sounds kind of traumatic. Yeah, that sounds kind of bad, especially if you are attached to that self and it is important to you, which it is for most people, then it's kind of traumatic. That's why people are afraid of death. Yeah, I will be destroyed when I die. This is kind of the materialist doctrine in the world, the kind of doctrine held by many people in the modern world. And that's kind of a bit scary. It's unpleasant because something very valuable to you, your very self, seems to be destroyed at that point. So two very, very different ideas, emotionally, fundamentally different. One is emotionally negative, the other one is emotionally positive. That is kind of important. And that actually leads to a very important point about Nibbana itself. Very often we discuss the idea of Nibbana, and what we are seeing here is how Nibbana just really means the ending of something, the cessation of things. Yeah, so we can say that from a point of view of existence, Nibbana is negative. There is no existence there. Yeah, so it is one of these it was just one of those philosophical ideas that is sometimes being used. It's ontology. Ontology is about the existence of things. So like you say that it is an ontological negative, but a psychological positive. So the idea of nibbana, the existence ends, but it's a psychological positive in the sense that it is psychologically worthwhile or interesting or nice or happy or whatever you have. It's one of those fancy ways of talking about nibbana. So, and then he replies, does it make sense to say that the Tathagata is annihilated and destroyed? And he replies, Reverend Sariputta, in my ignorance, I used to have that misconception. So now he has changed already. But now that I've heard the teaching from Venerable Sariputta, I've given up that misconception and I have comprehended the Dhamma, the teaching. Reverend Yamaka, suppose they were to ask you, when the body breaks up after death, what happens to the perfected one, the Arahant, who has ended the defilements? How would you answer him? Reverend, if they were to ask this, I would answer like this. Reverend, form is impermanent. What is impermanent is suffering. What is suffering has ceased and disappeared. Feeling, perception, choices, and consciousness are all impermanent. What is impermanent is suffering. What suffering has ceased and disappeared. That is how I would answer such a question. Cessation doctrine of the Buddha. Suffering has ceased. Good, Reverend Yamaka. Well then, I shall give you a simile to make the meaning even clearer. Suppose there was a householder or householder's son who was rich with a lot of money and great wealth and a bodyguard for protection. Then along comes a person who wants to harm, injure, and threaten them and take his life. They would think, this householder or householder's son is rich with a lot of money and great wealth and a bodyguard for protection. It won't be easy to take his life by force. Why don't I get close to him, then take his life? So he goes up to that householder or householder's son and says, Sir, I would serve you. I want to serve you. They would serve that householder or householder's son. They would get up before him, go to bed after him, be obliging, behaving nicely, and speaking politely. The householder or householder's son would consider them as a friend and companion and come to trust them. But when that person realizes that they have gained the trust of the householder or householder's son, then, when they know that he is alone, they would take his life with a sharp knife. What do you think, Yamaka? When that person went to the householder or the householder's son and offered to serve him, weren't they a killer then, though he didn't know that this was his killer? And when they got up before him and went to bed after him, being obliging, behaving nicely, and speaking politely, weren't they already a killer, though he didn't know that this was his killer? And when knowing he was alone, they would take his life with a sharp knife, weren't they a killer also then, though he didn't know that this was his killer? Yes, Reverend. In the same way, they truly don't understand form, which is a killer, as a killer. They don't truly understand feeling, which is a killer, as a killer. They don't truly understand perception as a killer, which is a killer, as a killer. They don't truly understand choices, which are a killer, as a killer. They don't truly understand consciousness, which is a killer, as a killer. It is the five khandhas. When we grasp them and desire them, these are kind of our killers. These are the things that perpetuate our samsaric existence. And because they perpetuate it, ultimately they are also responsible for the dying and being reborn, the dying and being reborn. That is kind of a very interesting way of looking at the five khandhas. These things that we take as dear and agreeable, that we take as a self, having a delusion, seeing something that is just an illusion, not really being real. Yeah, we see things in there which actually isn't there, but in reality, they are the exact opposite of what we want them to be. Instead of it being a self that is important to us and dear and agreeable to us, this is my beautiful self, oh, I got to look after it. Yeah, this is how we think, and it's natural to think like that. But the reality is the exact opposite. By holding on to that idea of a self, all we are doing is allowing the five khandhas to kill us again and again and again, going round and round and round. And that is the perniciousness of that illusion of a self. It binds you to samsara. We have now looked at the two things that bind us to samsara. On the one hand, you have the kama chanda, the desire for sensual pleasures. This is the most basic one, and in many ways the most difficult one to overcome. It is overcome by practicing the path and reaching samadhi. Once you come to samadhi, there is a danger you will take that samadhi as eternal, because that is what is done in most religions and teachings around the world. That is why you have to be careful, because if you do take that samadhi as eternal, you are allowing the five khandhas to kill you again and again and again, carrying on in existence. And so based on that samadhi, we'll need to use the Buddha's idea of right view to emerge from that illusion of a self. And when we emerge from the illusion of a self, there is nothing that is dear to us anymore. There is no I that we have to hold on to. All there is suffering arising and suffering passing away. And we're looking forward to the end of that suffering. And the end of that suffering first happens when you become an arahant, and it finally happens when the arahant dies at parinibbana. And that is what this teaching is all about. And that is why these views are so important, to understand them in the right way. So that is really all I wanted to say on this retreat. But I have a little sutta just to end off, to kind of conclude everything, which is kind of nice and uplifting, at least that's how I find it. And this is a little sutta, I'm just going to read it out. I'm not going to comment very much, just to read it out to you. And this is in the Nidana Samyutta, number 22, and it's called the 10 Powers, the Dasa Bala Sutta. So, the teaching has been well explained by me, says the Buddha, made clear, opened, illuminated, and stripped of patchwork, stripped of the useless stuff. Just this much is quite enough for a gentleman or a gentlewoman who has gone forth out of faith to rouse up their energy. Gladly let only skin, sinews, and tendons remain. Let the flesh and blood waste away in my body. I will not stop trying until I have achieved what is possible by human strength, energy, and vigor. A lazy person lives in suffering, mixed up with bad, unwholesome qualities, and ruins a great deal of their own good. An energetic person lives happily, secluded from bad, unskillful qualities, and fulfills a great deal of their own good. The best isn't reached by the worst. The best is reached by the best. The spiritual life is the cream, mendicants, and the teacher is before you. So you should rouse up energy for attaining the unattained, achieving the unachieved, and realizing the unrealized, thinking, in this way our going forth will not be wasted, but will be fruitful and fertile, and our use of robes, armed food, lodgings, and medicines, and supplies for the sick shall be of great fruit and benefit for those who offered them. That's how you should train. Considering your own good mendicants is quite enough for you to persist with diligence. Considering the good of others is quite enough for you to persist with diligence. Considering the good of both is quite enough for you to persist with diligence. Okay, so sometimes the Buddha really is kind of inspiring. You can see here he's trying to inspire the Sangha, the bhikkhus, and maybe the bhikkhunis, and trying to lift them up and to let them understand the urgency of this. Yeah, get going. And if you want to be happy, if you want to produce something positive in this world, then practice the teaching, make the most of it. Now is the opportunity. Don't waste this chance. Remember that there's nothing more important in life. Sometimes we get distracted by the unimportant things in existence, as if they really matter, as if that is what life is about. But what life really is about is the Dhamma practice. That is where you find meaning, that is where you find happiness, that is what you find everything you ever wanted. In fact, you find more than you ever wanted, because you didn't even know that you wanted these things. These things are beyond your imagination in many ways, like the idea of non-self. And only by realizing it can you understand how profound and meaningful it actually is. So this is what the Buddha teaches us. So I hope I haven't challenged you too much. I'm sure the monastics here are very fine with his teachings, and probably most of the lay people as well. You have all been Buddhists for a long time. But it's very important to remember these things. There is a lot of wrong view in the world. I actually asked Venerable Dhammita, I asked him, well, what should we talk about during this retreat? And he was the one who suggested right view. And I thought that was really a really good idea. So I agreed to that. And because I also know that there is so many wrong views going around. And so if we can be a force for good, if we can help to establish right view in the world, and kind of read the Buddha's teachings in the right way, then what a wonderful contribution we will be doing to the Dhamma. What a wonderful contribution we'll be doing to keeping the sasana going in the future. But that right view has to be conjoined also with the right kind of practice. Only when we practice in the right way will that become very powerful. We mentioned yesterday someone was concerned about the decline of the sasana and how we can ensure that the sasana is kept going in the future. And the truth is that the best way to keep it going is to practice it, because it is people who have integrity, who are virtuous, and whose character comes out through their conduct. You can see that someone is different because of the way they conduct themselves. Those are the people who are listened to. Those are the people who are listened to by the wise. There will always be foolish people who are led astray by all kinds of crazy ideas, conspiracy theories and what have you, but the wise will know where to look. And it is the wise that we should hope that will understand the teaching of the suttas, not the unwise. So if some people don't get it, that's okay. As long as even one other person understands the Dhamma, then it is worthwhile teaching it in this way. So this is why we have focused on right view, and why this matters so much, how this is the foundation for everything in our practice, how the whole path begins and ends with right view, and how the path in between is about the gradual purification of that right view until it kind of comes through as a real insight, a real understanding of reality. So what should we do? And how should you remember all of these teachings? How can you remember all of these words and every sutta here? You have to take the booklet and you have to read it every day when you go back, otherwise you will forget what's going on. No, that's the wrong way. That's not the right way, reading this booklet every day. Read the suttas of the Buddha. I would recommend you to forget about this particular booklet. Read other suttas, because other suttas will illuminate what we have been talking about here from different angles. And then these suttas will become more clear as a consequence. So read other suttas instead. But don't neglect the word of the Buddha. The word of the Buddha, the Dhamma that we have, is the most important literature in human history. And most people don't get that. There is nothing more important than this. Why? Because it gives us access to the highest happiness and to the highest meaning. What could be more important than that? Obviously, nothing. And so this is why it is so important. So when you know that you have the most important literature in the world, And you have access to that. On the internet, it is now accessible at suttacentral.net and also other places in books or whatever. And try to see if you can enjoy reading the suttas. And if you start enjoying it and you start understanding the Dhamma and you allow yourself to be inspired by these teachings, then you have a source that will be like a gold for you, be like a treasure for you, that you can go back to again and again and will support you in the practice throughout your life, whether as a monastic or as a layperson. So this is what we need to do. And however, it is very difficult to remember all of these things. Yeah, sometimes people say, "Oh, too many suttas, I can't remember even a fraction of it. What am I going to do?" There's a very famous story in the Vinaya. No, not in the Vinaya. Actually, this is in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Tika Nipata. This is sutta number 80 something, I think, where the Buddha. This monk goes to the Buddha and he says, "Oh, Venerable Sir, I can't remember all of these rules. Yeah, too many rules. In those days, there were 150 rules. Now there's even more." And so the Buddha said, well then, if you can't remember all the rules, can you at least remember the Adisila, the Adichitta, and Adipanya? Only 3 things. Yeah, 3 things is easier than 150 things. And the monk says, "Yes, I can remember those 3 things." And the Buddha said, "Well, in that case, just remember those 3 things and you will be fine." Yeah, so remember the Adisila, Adichitta, Adipanya. This is the most important thing. But sometimes 3 things is too many. Yeah, I can't remember 3 things. So let's simplify it even more. And remember that the Adichitta is Samadhi. Adipanya is the insights that arise out of Samadhi. And these things are, in a large sense, automatic on the path. If we purify the foundations, the fundamentals of the path, then meditation is almost automatic. You sit back, you wait, you are patient, and meditation kind of arises. It happens to you, you are the passenger. But for that to happen, you have to put in the causes at the very foundation. What are those causes? Well, we have been talking about it on this retreat a lot. Those causes, number 1 cause is sila, the other one is right view. So in your daily life, focus on sila. Focus on this foundation for everything else. And if you can purify that sila to a very, very high degree, much more than you have already, you are already very good people. But the point is that the bar is very high on the Buddhist path, and we need to clear the highest kind of bar. That is the problem. That highest bar means purifying your sila to the point where you always have metta, always have karuna in whatever you do in your daily life. That is the ideal that we're trying to reach. Yeah, and you can do it. You can do it if you persevere. You can do it if you commit. You just have to see this as the most important thing in life. Everything else is secondary. Remember the value hierarchy. The spiritual path is what really matters. Everything else in the world should only be pursued to help the spiritual path grow. Then you're thinking about things in the right way. So remember sila. Remember kindness. Kindness kind of summarizes sila in a very nice way, because kindness means good actions by body, good actions by speech, and good actions by mind. And so if you can remember that one single word on the path, kindness, and practice that consistently all the time, moment after moment, day after day, year after year, then you're going to go a long way on this path. And sometimes you will need a bit of inspiration, you will need a boost to remind you what the Dhamma is, and then go and listen to a nice Dhamma discourse, read a nice sutta, whatever supports you in your practice. Yeah? And that is also then the Ujjukaditi, that is the other factor that enables the path to work. Then you have sila and you have Ujjukaditi coming together. And that is really all you have to do. In fact, it is not all, it is a lot already. If you can do that, you are doing amazingly well, because actually it is very hard to do that. It is not hard because it's difficult to understand, it's easy to understand. This is one of the beautiful things about the Buddhist path. It's not that difficult to understand what we are supposed to do. The hard part is the perseverance and the commitment on the path, and that is what we have to do. And that is where success happens. So, I have said enough. Said too much probably already. Too late now, I've said it. So that's really all. I wish you all all the very best. And it's been very nice to have so many monastics coming, so thank you for coming along. It makes the retreat far more interesting and special. Thank you for all the bhikkhunis for coming as well. It's wonderful to have you all here. And of course, the lay people. It's very nice when we have the 4 parisas coming together in this way. Yeah, it kind of gives a feeling of a complete Buddhist community, and that is especially powerful. So from me, been wonderful to be here. I have enjoyed reading these suttas and then contemplating the suttas, and I hope you have enjoyed it as well. And that is really all I have to say, except I would like to thank, for my part, before I pass the microphone over to others, for my part to thank the organizer, especially Venerable Dhammita, who I have been contacting with, and I've also been in contact with Rohanta quite a bit, but I know that many, many other people have also been part of this. So it's a wonderful thing that you are supporting this, and doing something. I think it is very worthwhile. So thank you everyone for being part of this and doing such good work and living the life in the right kind of way. So okay, so I'm going to pass the microphone over to who? Is it you, Venerable Dhammita? Are you going to? No, okay, Venerable Animita. Okay, great.
And this is the opportunity to express our gratitude, especially to Venerable Ajahn Brahmali. It was very inspiring and uplifting to hear the Dhamma and to practice with you, Venerable Sir. So we all wish, in the name of all the participants, I want to share the merits with you, Venerable Sir. May all this goodness, which was collected in this week, be conducive to your health and happiness and longevity, and may it help you to further progress on the path and attain to the supreme bliss of Nibbana. And also, in the name of all the participants, I want to thank Venerable Dhammita. He was helping with the organization of this retreat, and also translating and managing this event. So may also he be well and happy, and may all this merit help him to progress further on the path and attain to the supreme bliss of Nibbana. And also we want to thank the team of the NIIBS, especially Venerable Bodhagama Chandima, Nayaka Swahinansetter, and all the management and kitchen and cleaning staff. And also we want to thank all the supporters who sponsored the Sangha to be able to participate in this retreat. And also all the dayakas who offered dana and brought supplements for that. Special thanks goes to the audiovisual team for your support. Also the Vishwa Parami Society for managing the tea stations. And also we want to thank all the dayakas who sponsored the book printing for our Sutta material and other requisites, and Venerable Sela and her team for translating the singular version of the Sutta material. And also special thanks goes to the ABSSL team, who organized this event, all the helpers and volunteers who attended to the day-to-day activities. And last but not least, I want to thank all the participants for coming, for making this retreat possible. May this effort you made in these few days help you to straighten out your view further, and may it also help you to progress in the Dhamma and attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. And also, I want to share, let's share our merits with Venerable Metta Vihari, who passed away last year. Actually, he was the founder of the Ajahn Brahmali Society, and wherever he is now, may he well be well and happy, and may he rejoice in the merit which was produced here, and may it be conducive to his attaining of the supreme bliss of Nirvana. So, මා සංඝරත්නයන් අවසරයි ශ්‍රද්ධාවන්ත පින්වත්නි මොකද්ද හරි දැන් ඇහෙනවනේ මේ අවස්ථාවේදී අපි මේ භාවනා වැඩසටහන අවසන් කරන අවස්ථාව අපි මේ ඉංග්‍රීසියෙන් දැන් පින් අනුමෝදන් කරා සිංහලෙන්ත් පින් අනුමෝදන් කරමු මේ දවස් කීපය තුළ අපිට සම්මාදිට්ඨිය පිළිබඳ ඉතාමත්ම වටිනා විස්තරයක් අහගන්න හම්බ වුණා. සූත්‍රය ඇසුරෙන් අචාන් බ්‍රහ්මාලි ස්වාමීන් වහන්සේ බොහොම අවංකව අදහස් ඉදිරිපත් කරගෙන ඒ සූත්‍රය තමන්ට වැටහෙන ආකාරයෙන් අපිට පැහැදිලි කරලා දුන්නා. හුදකලා ජීවිතයක් ගත කරන මේ ස්වාමීන් වහන්සේලාට ඒක බොහොම වටිනා අවස්ථාවක්. සාමාන්‍යයෙන් අපි වැඩිපුර කරන්නේ පොත් කියවන එකනේ. නමුත් සජීවව වැඩි ස්වාමීන් වහන්සේ නමක් පාදමූල ඉඳගෙන ඒ ධර්ම ශ්‍රවණ කිරීම විශේෂම වටිනාකමක් තියෙන බව මේ දවස් කීප තුළ තේරුම් ගත්තා. භාවනාවත් එක්ක සම්බන්ධ වෙලා ඒක ශ්‍රවණ කරනකොට තවත් හොඳට හිතට කාවදිනවා. ඒක නිසා වටිනා අවස්ථාවක් සම්මාදිට්ඨිය ඇති කරගන්න, ඍජු කරගන්න. අපි මේ දවස් කීප තුළ ජනිත කරගත්තා වූ සියලුම කුසල ශක්තිය බලෙන් අපි අචාන් බ්‍රහ්මාලි ස්වාමීන් වහන්සේට අනුමෝදන් කරමු. උන්වහන්සේට නිදුක් නිරෝගී සුවපත් භාව සැලසේවා. තමන්ගේ සීල සමාධි ප්‍රඥා තවත් වර්ධනය කරගෙන හැකිතාක් ඉක්මනින් මේ දුක් සංසාර ගමන කෙලවර කරගන්න කුසල ශක්තිය උන්වහන්සේට ඒකාන්තයෙන්ම හේතු වාසනා වේවා කියලා පින් අනුමෝදන් කරමු. ඒ වගේම අපේ දමිත ආශ්‍රමයට වහන්සේට ඒ කුසල ශක්තිය අනුමෝදන් කරමු. උන්වහන්සේ බොහොම මානසික වුණා. මේ දවස් කීප තුළ අපිට මේ භාවනා වැඩසටහන සාර්ථක කරගන්න උදව් කරා. ඒ සංවිධාන කටයුතුත් කරගත්තා. පරිවර්තන කටයුතු බොහොම හොඳින් කරගත්තා. කරලා දුන්නා. ඒ උතුම් පින් බලයෙන් උන්වහන්සේට නිදුක් නිරෝගී සුවපත් භාව සැලසේවා. උන්වහන්සේට ප්‍රාර්ථනීය බෝධියකින් අමා මහ නිවන සුවසේ නිවී සැනසීම පිණිස ඒ කුසල ශක්තිය හේතු වාසනා වේවා කියලා පින් අනුමෝදන් කරමු. ඒ වගේම NIIBS මේ නාගනන්ද ජාත්‍යන්තර බෞද්ධ අධ්‍යයන ආයතන නායක ස්වාමීන් වහන්සේ වන බෝධාගම චන්දිම නායක ස්වාමීන් වහන්සේටත් ඒ වගේම කළමනාකරු පිරිසද කුසිය සහ පිරිසිදු කිරීම කටයුතු කරපු අයටත් විශේෂම ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙනවා අපි. ඒ වගේම සිළුම මහා සංඝරත්නයටත් මහණන් වහන්සේලාටත් මේ භාවනා වැඩසටහන කරගන්න දායක වූ පින්වත්තුන්ට ඒ වගේම අපිට මේ දවස් කීප තුළ දාන සපය දුන් සියලු දායකයන්ට මේ කැමරා කටයුතු කරගෙන ගිය මහත්තයාටත් ඉන්නෝන මහත්තයාට විශේෂ ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙනවා. ඒ වගේම විශ්ව පාරමී සොසයිටි එකටත් ගිලන්පස කටයුතු සපය දෙන්න කටයුතු කරපු ඒ පින්වත්තුන්ට ඒ වගේම අපිට සිංහල පොත මේ සූත්‍ර උපටගත් සිංහල පොත පරිවර්තන කරපු දායකයන්ටත් ඒ වගේම ඒ පරිවර්තන කටයුතු කරපු සීලා මෑණන් වහන්සේ සහ කණ්ඩායමට ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙනවා. ඒ වගේම මේ ශ්‍රී ලංකා Ajahn Brahma Society කණ්ඩායමටත් ඒ කටයුතු වලට උදව් උපකාර කරපු සියලු දෙනාටත් ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙනවා, පින් දෙනවා. ඒ සියලු දෙනාටමත් මේ භාවනා වැඩසටහනට සහ සම්බන්ධ වූ සියලු දෙනාටමත් අපි සියලු දෙනාම ජනිත කරගත්තා වූ ඊතුරින් කුසල ශක්තිය බලේ ඒ සියලු දෙනාටම අනුමෝදන් කරමු. අනුමෝදන් වෙත්තා. ඒ සියලු දෙනාටම තව තවත් තමන්ගේ ධර්මයේ පාරමිතාව පූර්ණේ කර ගැනීමට නිදුක් නිරෝගී සුවපත් භාව ලැබීමටත් ඒ වගේම සීල සමාධි ප්‍රඥා සම්පූර්ණත්වයට පත් කරගෙන චතුරාර්ය සත්‍ය ධර්ම අවබෝධ කර ගැනීම පිණිස ඒ කුසල ශක්තිය හේතු වාසනා වේවා කියලා පින් අනුමෝදන් කරමු. ඒ වගේම අපි අපත්‍ය වදාළ අතිගෞරවනීය මෙත්ත විහාරී ස්වාමීන් වහන්සේටත් ඒ කුසල ශක්තිය අනුමෝදන් කරමු. උන්වහන්සේ කොතැන හිටියත් ඒ අපි කරගෙන යන වැඩ පිළිවෙලදී බලලා සතුටු වෙලා පින් අනුමෝදන් වෙලා උන්වහන්සේටත් මේ දුක් සංසාර ගමන කෙලවර කරගන්නට ඒ කුසල ශක්තිය අනුමෝදන් වීමෙන් හේතු වාසනා වේවා කියලා ප්‍රාර්ථනා කරමු. සියලු දෙනාටම තෙරුවන් සරණයි.
And maybe nice to share the memory to the traditional way and then pay respect to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha one last time before we end off. So let's share the memory to the way, traditional way, and then pay respect. Edang me nyati nang hotu sukhita hontu nyatayo. Edang me nyati nang hotu sukhita hontu nyatayo. Edang me nyati nang hotu sukhita hontu nyatayo. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And very respectable person.